Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. Several Arab countries have pledged their support to assist the United States in their campaign against the Islamic State, who still hold large swathes of territory in Iraq and Syria. Flaminia Giambalvo has this report.
Several Arab countries have offered to launch airstrikes on the group calling itself the Islamic State, according to U.S. officials. The move suggests a widening of Washington's campaign against the group. The officials declined to identify which countries had made the offers. The U.S. was reviewing the offers on Sunday as it begins to identify roles in its coalition against fighters who control parts of Iraq and Syria. Over the past weeks, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has been meeting with several heads of state, all of whom pledged support to the U.S.-led campaign.
الأول أنني شرحت القرار الذي صدر من وزراء الخارجية العرب في السابع من هذا الشهر، والذي اتخذ فيه الوزراء الخارجية العرب قرارا واضحا بمواجهة شاملة مع كل الظواهر التي نراها الآن والتحديات والتطرف في المنطقة، ومواجهتها مواجهة شاملة بمعنى أنها سياسية، عسكرية، أمنية، ثقافية، فكرية، اقتصادية، حتى قضائية ذكروها من كل الجوانب.
On Thursday, John Kerry also won backing for a coordinated military campaign from 10 Arab countries, including Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and 6 Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Participants of the U.S. coalition against the fighters are meeting in Paris today. The conference brings Iraqi authorities together with 15 to 20 international players.
Cette conférence a un seul objectif: apporter aux nouvelles autorités irakiennes le soutien politique qui leur est nécessaire pour lutter contre une menace majeure qui s'appelle Daesh et qui fait peser sur l'Irak, sur la région du Moyen-Orient et sur le monde un risque.
So far, France has been the only country to publicly offer to join U.S. airstrikes on Islamic State targets, although it has said its involvement would be limited to Iraq. The U.S. comments came a day after the IS group stirred fresh outrage with release of a video of the beheading of British aid worker David Haines, highlighting that the fighter group has no intention of backing down. As of Saturday, U.S. fighter jets had conducted 160 airstrikes on Islamic State positions in Iraq. The international community is preparing to wage war on the group known as Islamic State. And with the fighter group showing no sign of backing down, there are increasing concerns we might be on the verge of a new global conflict. Flaminia Giambalvo, The Report.
Well, joining me to provide some commentary on this issue, we have Sami Ramadani, who's a political commentator and a lecturer in sociology at the Metropolitan University in London, and Paul Schulte, who's a visiting senior research fellow at King's College London. Welcome to the programme, both of you. So, Sami, do you get a sort of bad sensation of mission creep here? First of all, it was limited strikes to get the Yazidis off the mountain. Now it's widened to Syria. There's a coalition building. David Cameron is about to announce his involvement in this.
Absolutely, and they've already sent hundreds of more soldiers to Iraq, American soldiers. I don't know what they mean that there will be no boots on the ground. I don't know what these soldiers are wearing when they send them to Iraq. Trainers or what? I think mission creep is a good description, because a lot of these wars started in that manner. Even the infamous Vietnam War started with trainers and advisors, and then one incident after another it escalated into a massive war. And even the big Iraq war was preceded by bombing raids and sanctions and so forth. So these things do tend to escalate, and it seems to suit the war industries to do so as well. There's always a push, an impulse almost in the economic system and the industrial base in the United States, that war seems to be an outlet for greater profits and so on. So there is this background as well, which is pushing towards greater conflicts, military involvement involvement within the context of Syria, Iraq, the Middle East. The United States seems to be hungry for more military bases, and they are now expanding their big military base near Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan. Erbil is the administrative capital of the Kurdish region in Iraq, and there is a very big military base there, but they are building more. And it seems the United States want to make Iraqi Kurdistan a really big new base from which to launch operations, to influence the politics of the region and so forth. So definitely we're looking at probably an expanding military involvement here.
I mean, Paul, even if you think the expanded military involvement is a good thing, it's often said that if you're going to mount a military operation, you need to have some view of where the end game is. Do you think they have one?
Well, the end game, we're told, is the destruction of the Islamic State, or the un-Islamic State on other terminology. So the phrase mission creep I don't think fits very well here, because what was announced before there was any of this coalition assembled was the objective of destroying the Islamic State. How that's being done was obviously going to require troops and aircraft and bases and all that stuff. So the fact that these are now being announced doesn't seem to me a creep. It's part of the mission that was fairly clearly, given the eruption of the Islamic State, the fall of Mosul, the sudden appearance of this strange, aggressive politico-military phenomenon, politico-military religious phenomenon, that's not surprising. You would expect there to be bases. Because if you're going to do an air campaign in Kurdistan, you want airfields in Kurdistan. You don't want to have to fly backwards and forwards. This is, I think, far from it being the Americans wanting to be back there. It's very obvious that Obama is deeply embarrassed by having to go back there. This isn't what the American administration wanted to have to do. It's being dragged into this because of the, one hopes, temporary collapse of the Iraqi armed forces a few months ago.
Is it perhaps that the declared objective can't be reached without creep in the means? That is, that the destruction of the Islamic State.
It's the creation of the means.
Well, whatever word we use here for an expansion of the military forces being deployed, that it'll end up with far more forces being deployed than the current story is.
Yes, and also the United States, I don't think so much Obama objecting to increase military involvement, but the U.S. administration has changed its tactics, let's put it this way. Instead of sending hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers and British soldiers in the case of the Iraq War, they have adopted the strategy, and this is Obama's strategy, that instead of having so many U.S. soldiers getting involved and massive opposition from Americans across the world, use local forces. And they are using proxy forces. And I think the phenomena of the rise of the IS terrorist organization has given the United States an opportunity to use these local forces in a much bigger way. The agenda here is much bigger. You've got Iran, still a major obstacle to U.S. plans in the region. You've got Syria, where they have so far failed to overthrow the Assad regime, and they have been backing these armed groups in Syria for several years now, a few years now. And within even an Iraqi context, these terrorist organizations were, at least, to put it very mildly, were turned a blind eye to growth since 2005-06 in Iraq, when the U.S. was meeting enormous resistance in Iraq. Divide and rule became a strategic way of dealing not only with Iraq, but gradually within the whole region. Split the populations into Shia, Sunni, Christian, Yazidi, Kurd, and so on. And you look around you, and in each of these components, the United States seem to have a foothold, whether it's amongst the Kurds or the Sunnis or the Shia or the Christians. And this is a scenario, I think, which suits the United States because it has failed in its previous direct occupation type involvement. The objective here, we should not forget, is to dominate the natural resources of the region. You're talking about oil. You're talking about a massively strategic area. You're talking about Israel. This also suits the Israeli agenda in the region.
Paul, what do you make of the Iraqi government's decision to call off airstrikes because they think that they are pushing more local groups into alliance with the Islamic State because, as happens with airstrikes, they're hitting the wrong target?
I think that's only a temporary decision. They are not going to be able to get back lost territory. They're not going to be able to become again an effective government over most of Iraq without using air power because they don't have enough troops. The troops are not hardened enough to take ground without air attacks. So I simply wouldn't make too much of that. I would also be sceptical of vast profit-driven conspiracies as an explanation for what's going on. I mean, the Middle East is complex enough that you can always find underlying things which can be brought into a pattern like that, if that's your concern, to find patterns like that. But I think it's much more historically credible to say that what's going on is a reaction to a set of circumstances and a threat that nobody expected and the Americans didn't want. And they're having to improvise because, yes, it's quite right, they don't want to send troops. The American public doesn't want its troops to be killed, and the locals in the Middle East don't, we have learned, particularly like Western troops in big numbers on the ground. So it was pretty obvious that if there was to be a continued conflict, it wouldn't be with mass deployments of Western troops.
Sorry, what do you make of American policy now towards the so-called moderate opposition in Syria? We're talking about the Free Syrian Army. I mean, first they boosted the Free Syrian Army and they were their interlocutors. Then they said these people are useless, so they dumped them. Now they're back on as recipients of arms, and yet at precisely the moment when we hear that a lot of FSA people, or at least some FSA people, may be joining the Islamic State because it's a more effective opposition. What do you make of that?
In terms of Western involvement in Syria, you can't really make it up. It's so ridiculous that the tactics are changing by the week sometimes. But the overall picture is and was and still is this flow of funds from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and Turkey has played a major role. Turkey is a NATO member. There is on the public record a center for the CIA in Turkey that is used to funnel arms and funds to particular groups. And you are right, the strategy unfolded because the Syrian opposition is so divided among so many different groups. And these groups usually split in accordance to who is paying whom on the ground, which country is backing which of these armed groups, and that always led to enormous tensions between the armed groups. Currently, they are talking about moderates. How can you have a moderate armed group? And on the ground, as all observers have reported, independent observers, whether here in Britain, across Europe, and the United States, on the ground, arms that go to so-called moderates seem to end up with IS or with Al-Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda, official Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And I think really this campaign now to form a coalition under the US leadership to fight IS, I think it's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, because you're talking about states that have actually helped produce these terror organizations. So to go and pretend that they are leading the war to fight them is really a ploy, in my opinion, a political ploy, because these organizations have very, very strong links with local forces that are very close allies of the United States. So there is a problem within this so-called coalition. They either genuinely boycott these terror groups, which I don't see a sign of as yet, or they are playing a game, because you cannot bomb them in Iraq and at the same time arm groups in Syria, which ultimately are also allies on the ground with IS. It doesn't make sense.
Paul, what do you make? I mean, one side of this is the kind of, sort of political or diplomatic okey-cokey with the FSA. First they're in, then they're out, then they're in again. Well, but the other aspect that people find, I think, difficult to cope with is that on the one hand, the government is refusing to pay ransom for nationals that have been taken hostage. On the other hand, the border with Turkey seems to be still open. There are, as everybody now acknowledges, tanker loads of oil which are run by ISIS over the border and sold on the black market. I mean, there's something that doesn't match up here, isn't there?
You're talking of a contradiction between who exactly? The British state isn't in control of the Turkish-Syrian border, and the Turks are in control of that, and they've got their own. You would have thought it was part of British policy to say to a NATO member, "Look, get on top of this." Well, no doubt conversations are going on with the Americans, the Brits, others. The French are taking a hard line. The Turks have their own concerns, but one of the things which I think has not been adequately covered over here is the way that the beheading of the two Americans and the Briton is not so much aimed at influencing the Americans or the British. It's going to influence the Turks, because there are 47 Turkish diplomats and their families who were captured in Mosul, and there is a quite believable probability that those people would also be executed on TV if the Turkish government tightened up in ways that I think most of us would want. That would have enormous political ramifications inside Turkey. So what's happening here is partly quite successful murderous blackmail, and at least so far it is proving to be quite an effective tactic.
Well, on that slightly gruesome point, we'll have to leave this discussion because we've run out of time, but we'll be coming back to our guests for commentary later on in the programme.